The community centre buzzed with anticipation, the folding chairs packed with neighbours, proud parents, and chattering teenagers. It was the annual Youth Talent Showcase, an event as much about the performances as it was about town gossip and unspoken rivalries. The air smelled faintly of popcorn and old carpet. On stage, the host, a jittery volunteer from the local library, announced the next act with a forced cheer. Up next, we have Eliza Raymond performing spoken word poetry. A brief, polite applause followed as Eliza stepped onto the small stage, gripping a folded paper in one hand. She was 17, tall but slouched, wearing a simple blue dress that clung awkwardly to her frame. Her hearing aid blinked faintly under her brown curls. She stood alone in the spotlight, trying to breathe through the weight of hundreds of eyes. Eliza opened her mouth and began to speak, her voice soft but determined. The words at first came smoothly, then the mic crackled. A feedback squeal rang out, interrupting her rhythm. The sound system distorted her voice slightly, turning her delicate articulation into something offbeat and hollow. People stirred in their seats. Someone snorted. Then came the whispering. Eliza tried to keep going, faltering only slightly, until a loud voice from the back pierced the murmur. "Use sign language next time, sweetheart." Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel. Eliza froze. Her poem, the one she had spent weeks crafting in her bedroom, whispering to herself, recording over and over to make sure she sounded normal, crumbled in her hands. The host, caught between pity and panic, rushed up with a forced smile and thanked her, ushering her off stage with a too gentle hand. She didn't walk. She ran. Out the side door into the humid night, tears streaking her cheeks before she even hit the pavement. Behind the building, she collapsed onto the concrete, gasping and humiliated, her chest heaving as sobs overtook her. Inside, the show went on. No one followed, except one girl, local, popular, and cruel in that casual, confident way. She pulled out her phone and filmed Eliza crying, barely muffling her giggles. "This is gold," she whispered to her friend. Raymond, Eliza's father, had been in the back the entire time. He had stood when the laughter began, then stopped. He didn't speak, didn't go after her. His face was blank, his eyes full of something between embarrassment and fear. And just like all the other times, he did nothing. Later that night, the video would make its rounds, online. By morning, Eliza would be known not for her poem, but for her breakdown, for being that girl, the one who tried and failed too visibly. Eliza's world was small, like the town itself. Narrow roads, chipped sidewalks, and the constant smell of manure and fried food from the old diner on Main. She lived in a crumbling 2-bedroom house on the edge of town with her father, Raymond, a former mechanic who hadn't held steady work in years. The garage he once owned now sat shuttered, overtaken by weeds and rust. Raymond spent his days in a recliner, watching TV with the volume blaring loud enough to shake the windows, a bottle always within reach. When he looked at Eliza, it was rarely with love, more often with something colder, more tired. He blamed her, in unspoken ways, for everything that went wrong, for her hearing loss, for the bills, for Melinda walking out the door. Eliza had been only 10 when her mother left. The memory came in flashes. Her mother throwing clothes into a suitcase, shouting that she couldn't raise a mute daughter with a man who didn't listen himself, then slamming the door behind her without so much as a backward glance. Eliza had cried that night, not loudly, but in the muffled way of someone who'd learned early how invisible pain could become when no one was listening. Since then, silence had become her companion. Not just the silence of hearing loss, but the deeper, lonelier silence of being unwanted. At school, things weren't much better. Teachers spoke to her like they were walking on eggshells, soft voices, overly enunciated words, always followed by a condescending smile or a pat on the shoulder. Students weren't so subtle. Eliza was the charity case, deaf girl, or simply ignored altogether. Her hearing aid was a target, her quiet voice often mocked or talked over. She learned early to fade into the background. She ate lunch alone, sat in the back row, and avoided eye contact. But while she kept to herself, Eliza's mind never stopped moving. She devoured books from the dusty town library, taught herself economics from YouTube videos with auto captions, and read real estate blogs late into the night, dreaming of owning something, anything that couldn't be taken away. Her only friend, if you could call him that, was Marcus. He was lanky, with a lopsided grin, and a habit of talking too much when he was nervous, which was often. Like Eliza, he didn't fit in. He wore second-hand clothes and lived with his grandparents after his parents overdosed years ago. They found each other one rainy afternoon in the school library, both pretending not to be hiding. Since then, they spent weekends in an abandoned barn on the edge of town, half collapsed and covered in graffiti, talking about everything and nothing. He made her laugh sometimes. Other times, he looked at her the way the teachers did, like someone fragile, like someone to feel sorry for, and that hurt more than the teasing, because she didn't want pity, she wanted a way out. Lately, the town had grown more restless. The poultry farm, the largest employer for miles, was being shut down and put up for auction. People whispered about who might be buying it, but no one knew for sure. Rumours swirled. Maybe a corporate chain. Maybe a shady developer. Eliza listened to those whispers, even if no one ever spoke them to her directly. Something about the hush of it all made her uneasy. Land was being sold off in pieces, quietly, under the table. Families who'd lived here for generations were suddenly packing up and leaving without saying goodbye. No one knew what was coming, only that it would likely be worse than what they had. Eliza watched it all from the margins, unseen, unheard, but never unaware. While the town dismissed her as broken, she was quietly piecing things together. Every time someone underestimated her, she took note. Every time someone lied, she remembered. She was tired of being the girl nobody heard, tired of the silence. One day she swore she'd break it, not with words, but with action, with something so undeniable, even this town would have to listen. It arrived on a Tuesday, in a thick white envelope with gold-trimmed lettering that didn't match anything Eliza had ever received before. The return address was from a law firm in the city, clean, expensive-looking, foreign to the dust and grime of her world. She opened it slowly in her room, away from Raymond's line of sight. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the pages. The letter was formal, but the words hit like a thunderclap. Her maternal grandmother, Evelyn Monroe, a woman Eliza had never met, had died and left her entire estate solely to Eliza. Over $600,000 in land and cash. Her breath caught. Her heart beat louder than any sound in the room. Evelyn had owned swathes of property across the county, accumulated from decades of shrewd land deals, all managed quietly from afar. Eliza had grown up believing they had no family, no safety net, nothing. And now, she was holding a key to a future that once felt impossible. Alongside the legal jargon was a handwritten note, shaky but deliberate. Silence holds more power than noise. Use this well. It was the only thing Evelyn had left beyond the money. No apology, no explanation, just a riddle-like benediction. When Raymond found out, he exploded. She had hidden the letter for 2 days before the lawyer called the house and left a message. Raymond stormed into her room, waving the letter with trembling hands, red-faced and stinking of whiskey. "You think this makes you something?" he yelled. "That money should be mine. I raised you, damn it. I kept a roof over your head." Eliza stood still, her hands clenched at her sides. Something inside her refused to bend. Maybe it was Evelyn's voice echoing in that single line. Maybe it was the years of being treated like a mistake. Either way, when Raymond stepped closer, demanding she sign over control of the funds, Eliza did something she had never done in her entire life. She looked him in the eye and said, clear and unshaking, "No." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Raymond froze. His fury didn't leave, but it lost its momentum, swallowed by shock. For a second, he didn't know how to respond, like he hadn't prepared for her to fight back. He left the room without another word, slamming the door hard enough to make her hearing aid buzz. By the end of the week, the news had spread across town like wildfire. Eliza Raymond, quiet, broken, forgettable Eliza, was now one of the wealthiest people in the county. Suddenly, the same teachers who had once pitied her began greeting her with wide, forced smiles. Parents who had sneered behind her back at the grocery store now nodded and called her such a bright girl. Classmates who had never so much as spoken to her sent her messages, asking to hang out, offering compliments soaked in sugar. Even Marcus seemed shaken, his usual ease replaced by hesitation. Eliza watched it all with cold clarity. She didn't speak much, didn't correct them or indulge them, but she didn't forget either. She remembered every snicker at her hearing aid, every whispered joke during class, every time they had looked right through her, and now they couldn't stop looking. It wasn't real kindness. It was hunger, greed wrapped in politeness. But for the first time, Eliza wasn't afraid. She had power now. Not just money, but the knowledge that she had worth before they ever saw it. And she would never again let someone else define her silence as weakness. The shift began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first chill of autumn before the leaves turn. Eliza made her first purchase less than a month after the inheritance cleared. A small, dilapidated house on Maple Street set to be foreclosed. It wasn't just any house. It belonged to the family of Harper Sloane, the same girl who had laughed while filming Eliza's breakdown outside the town hall. Harper's mother had lost her job, bills piled up, and the bank was ready to take everything. Eliza didn't make a scene. She made a phone call. Through a shell company, she acquired the deed. And then she waited. She didn't evict them, didn't raise the rent. She just let them live there, under her silent ownership, knowing that every time Harper walked through her front door, she was stepping onto ground Eliza now owned. It was a quiet kind of retribution, not loud or cruel, but calculated. And it was only the beginning. Raymond, meanwhile, spiraled further into bitterness. The more control Eliza gained, the more he unraveled. He drank earlier in the day, raged louder at night. He called her arrogant, accused her of becoming like her mother. Distant, cold, heartless. "This isn't who you are," he slurred one night, pointing a shaking finger at her pressed slacks and leather portfolio. "You're not better than the rest of us." But the truth was, he'd never known who she was to begin with. She didn't yell back. She didn't explain. She simply left the room, as silent as ever, while his voice cracked and dissolved behind her. The town began to buzz with tension. At first, people found her rise amusing, even entertaining, a strange, ironic success story. But as she kept buying, their laughter turned uneasy. One by one, she acquired storefronts on Main, a struggling hardware store, the old bakery no one could keep afloat, then the strip mall on the edge of town. The poultry farm, the lifeblood of the local economy, was the crown jewel. When that deal went through, something in the town's atmosphere shifted. The silence around Eliza stopped being ignorance. It became fear. Mayor Clay, who once smirked at her behind microphones and made veiled jokes about speaking up, suddenly changed his tune. He invited her to city council meetings, offered mentorship, even proposed partnerships. She turned him down with a single line typed on her phone. "I prefer silence, remember?" He smiled awkwardly and backed off. No one pushed after that. Marcus, however, wasn't smiling. He watched her with growing unease, their easy companionship now strained by the steel in her eyes. The barn they once used to hide in now stood empty most weekends. When he finally confronted her, it was with hands in his pockets and words weighted by disappointment. "You're not the same anymore," he said, almost softly. "You used to feel. Now you just move like a machine." Eliza met his eyes without blinking. "I was always this," she replied. "You just didn't listen." He didn't know how to respond. He walked away, and this time she didn't follow. Eliza's wardrobe changed. She wore tailored suits now, muted tones, sharp lines. She moved through the courthouse like she belonged there, attending every public auction, every zoning meeting. No one understood her plan, not even close. But they felt it, like the low hum of a distant storm. They whispered about her in cafes and at gas stations, guessing what she was after. Power, revenge. Nobody guessed the truth. Eliza wasn't after anything. She was building something real, something hers. Then came the article. A local reporter, an old classmate who once snickered behind her in study hall, wrote a piece titled, "From Mute to Mogul. The town's deaf girl buys her way to relevance." It ran in the Sunday paper with her photo, one taken without permission, of her stepping out of the courthouse, eyes hard, expression unreadable. The piece was smug, laced with sarcasm and skepticism, painting her rise as a strange, vaguely uncomfortable phenomenon. Eliza didn't respond. She didn't release a statement or take legal action. She didn't call the reporter. She simply clipped the article and pinned it inside her planner. Then she kept buying. By the time winter crept in, Eliza held more property in town than anyone except the county. She owned the poultry farm, the strip mall, 6 rental homes, and a growing list of parcels on the outskirts of town. She was the shadow at every transaction, the name behind every deed. And yet, inside, the silence remained. She still sat alone in the evenings, eating dinner at the small kitchen table where her father once barked at the television. She still walked by the empty barn and remembered the sound of Marcus's laughter before it dulled into distance. Her house was bigger now, cleaner, quieter. But it wasn't full. It never had been. Because no matter how many deeds she collected, how many headlines she stirred, Eliza was still the girl who had cried behind a building while the world laughed. Still the girl no one heard, until she gave them a reason to listen. The morning sun cast long shadows over the old town square, a place worn with history and haunted by memories. Especially for Eliza. It was here that she'd once stood, trembling under flickering lights, mocked, silenced, made a spectacle. And now, years later, it stood abandoned, faded banners flapping in the wind, ready to be auctioned off to cover decades of unpaid taxes. The townspeople gathered in anxious knots, murmuring as folding chairs scraped against pavement. No one said her name aloud, but everyone was waiting for her, and she didn't disappoint. Eliza arrived in a sleek black suit, sharp lines matching her expression. Her presence quieted the crowd like a storm rolling in. Cold, precise, undeniable. She moved without hesitation, her heels echoing against the cobblestones as she approached the registration table and took her bidding paddle. All eyes followed her, some out of awe, others out of fear. Then came the resistance, predictable, desperate. Mr. Clay, the town's aging mayor and a relic of its old guard, stepped forward with performative outrage. "You can't let her do this," he snapped at the auctioneer. "That land belongs to this town, to its people. We will not hand it over to outsiders." Eliza didn't blink. She looked straight ahead, then raised her hands and signed a brief message to the auctioneer, who nodded in understanding. The translation followed, clear and sharp. "I'm not an outsider. You just never saw me." The words hit like a slap, silencing even Clay. The crowd fell into a stunned hush. No one dared challenge her after that. The auction began, and the bidding was swift. A few local investors tried to compete, but none had the resources or the resolve. Eliza's offers came steadily, unwavering. Her expression never changed. With her final bid, she secured ownership of the town square, and with it, she now owned more of the town than anyone ever had. Properties, businesses, homes, and now the very place that once humiliated her. People waited for her next move, bracing for a declaration of dominance, a new development, maybe even a commercial centre stamped with her name. But what Eliza did next left the town breathless. She stepped forward again, handing the auctioneer a typed statement. The crowd leaned in, uneasy. The auctioneer read aloud, "I am not keeping this land." A ripple passed through the audience. "I am donating it to a non-profit I founded, Soundless Futures, a development trust run entirely by people with disabilities. Its mission is to create safe, inclusive, and dignified communities." Murmurs spread. Eliza stood still, emotionless, as the statement continued. "The town square will be transformed into an education and resource hub. Discounted housing will be offered to families in need. Job training centres will provide new opportunities. Children with special needs will have access to free learning programs run by people who understand them." The weight of it settled slowly, crushingly. This wasn't a takeover. It was a transformation. Eliza wasn't here to punish or gloat. She was here to build, to give what had never been given to her: safety, belonging, voice. The gasps gave way to silence, then something else: respect, perhaps, or shame. In that moment, the town saw her not just as rich, not just as powerful, but as something far more dangerous to the status quo: visionary. She hadn't just changed her life, she had rewritten the rules for everyone. Raymond sat slouched on the torn couch, surrounded by empty bottles and silence louder than any sound he'd ever heard. The TV flickered in front of him, grainy footage showing Eliza cutting the ribbon at the new Soundless Futures campus. She stood tall, poised, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a young girl wearing a hearing aid, just like she once had. Reporters praised her brilliance, her vision. The mayor stood beside her, no longer smug, but deferential. Raymond's hand trembled as he lifted his glass, then set it down. He didn't finish the drink. He just stared at the screen, eyes glassy. A tear slid down his cheek, quiet, unnoticed, and he didn't reach for the phone. Weeks later, Eliza boarded a bus alone and travelled across state lines to a quiet suburban home she had only seen once in a photo frame. Her mother, Melinda, answered the door in shock. Years had passed, but pain had kept them connected in the shadows. Over tea and silence, Eliza told her everything. The humiliation, the inheritance, the land, the foundation. She spoke slowly, deliberately. Her mother listened without interruption, hands covering her mouth. By the end, neither had words left. They cried. Not out of regret, not out of forgiveness, but from the weight of everything unsaid. They sat on that old couch, hand in hand, two women bound by blood and silence. And for once, it felt enough. When Eliza returned to the town, it wasn't the same. People greeted her now with hesitant smiles, with nods that came from somewhere real. The laughter had long since stopped. Some mothers stopped her in stores with watery eyes, murmuring soft apologies. Fathers brought their kids, children with cochlear implants and uncertain eyes, to soundless futures, hoping for a better world. Eliza didn't give speeches. She didn't make a show of acceptance. She simply nodded. Not every wound needs a voice to begin healing. And then, one afternoon, Marcus returned. He didn't text, didn't call. He just showed up at the old barn, still leaning a little when he walked, still unsure how to look her in the eyes. They sat on the steps like they used to, watching the wind move through the tall grass. "You didn't need me," he said, voice quieter now, weathered by time. "I needed you." Eliza glanced at him, then turned her gaze back to the horizon. "We all need something," she said. "I just stopped needing approval." He smiled faintly, a little broken, a little hopeful. Later that week, she offered him a job. Not charity, not pity. A position, a real place. He would help launch Soundless Future's latest project, a community radio station with full transcripts and sign language interpreters, a platform for unheard voices, a space where no one would be mocked for how they spoke, or didn't. Marcus accepted, not to prove himself, but to begin again. Power, Eliza had learned, didn't have to shout. It didn't need to crush or conquer. Sometimes power whispered, and sometimes that whisper was enough to shake a town to its core. 1 year later, the heart of the town had transformed. Where the old town hall once stood, where Eliza had once trembled under fluorescent lights and laughter, now rose a bright, welcoming building. The Soundless Futures Academy, a school for the deaf and hard of hearing. Its walls were painted in soft pastels, its windows wide and full of light. Children ran across the courtyard, laughing and signing, their voices a mix of sound and gesture. Some wore hearing aids, others didn't. None of them looked afraid. Eliza stood just beyond the gate, hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching with a quiet, settled kind of pride. She wasn't here for applause. No one crowded her for interviews anymore. She was just part of the landscape now. Present, grounded, no longer fighting to be seen. She knelt down and gently placed a small plaque into the soil beside the gate, brushing dust from its bronze edges. The words etched into it were simple. To the girl they didn't hear, "You were never broken, just unheard." She stood again and looked at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. Not for the cameras, not for the town, for herself. For the first time, she saw herself clearly, not as the girl who had once been laughed at, pitied again, but as a woman who had found power in her silence and strength in her truth. A wind stirred through the courtyard, soft and warm, carrying leaves and laughter in its wake. The camera pulled back, the frame widening as children ran, teachers waved, and Eliza stood still, centered, certain, whole. No soundtrack, no grand finale, just silence. But this time, it was full of life. And that was enough. Fade out.